Hello and welcome everyone to the Master of Educational Technology program at UBC. This is our podcast, the Anti-Racism Speaker Series. My name is Dr. Keri Ewart and I'm a faculty member for the Master of Educational Technology program, what we call MET at UBC, and the EDI coordinator and designer of the Anti-Racism Speaker Series.
Hi, I'm Tamika Fisher and I'm the EDI graduate academic assistant.
We would like to welcome everyone to the Anti-Racism Speaker Series, but before we dive into today's conversation, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the territory on which we gather and the Indigenous peoples who have been its stewards for countless generations. We recognize and honor the enduring presence of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nations. On the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory, UBC Point Grey, Vancouver campus of the Musqueam people, I would like to acknowledge the history of violence and the wrongdoings inflicted upon these Indigenous communities and many others throughout history as a result of colonialism and settler colonization. As an uninvited ally to this beautiful land, it is my responsibility to listen, learn, and engage in meaningful action to address the ongoing impacts of colonization and to support the reclamation and revitalization of Indigenous ways of learning, knowing, and doing. In today's episode, we have the esteemed privilege of learning from an Indigenous knowledge keeper who will share their wisdom, experience, and insights on advancing Indigenous education. We believe that through collaboration, education, and commitment to change, we will work towards a more just and equitable future. As Senator Murray Sinclair states, it is through education that Indigenous peoples were stripped of their rights, freedoms, languages, cultures, and traditions at the hands of the Canadian government. Instead, Indigenous peoples had to endure violence and racism in many facets. Sinclair believes that it is through education and the collaboration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples over the course of 7 to 10 generations that reconciliation and equity will be fully achieved. It is the belief that through collaboration, education, and a commitment to change, we can work towards a more just and equitable future. We invite our listeners and viewers to join us on this journey of understanding and together contribute to positive change and healing. We ask everyone to please take a moment to focus your thoughts and actions on both recognizing and acknowledging the land on which you work, play, and live, and to the original caretakers of this land. I would like to invite Tamika to share your land and territorial acknowledgement if you wish at this time.
Thanks, Keri. Hi, my name is Tamika Fisher, and I'm an uninvited settler on the traditional, ancestral, and stolen territories of the Musqueam and Coast Salish peoples. I'm grateful to my hosts for the privilege of being here today and thank them for their stewardship of this life-giving, beautiful place. I am, and my father is from the island of Honshu in Japan, and my settler mother was born on the territory of the Lower Kootenai First Nation. My intention today is to be a humble learner and to listen and bear witness to the wisdom that will be shared with us so that we can learn and unlearn in order to support anti-racism and reduce the harms that Indigenous peoples continue to experience in education.
Thank you. The Master of Educational Technology program educates professionals on the use and the impact of digital learning technologies. This fully online graduate program provides a unique opportunity for our students to engage in topics such as the role of EdTech in racism and anti-racism. And since the degree program was launched in 2022, close to 2,000 individuals have enrolled in the UBC MET program, with more than 450 students enrolled currently. MET dedicates itself to supporting its learners, stakeholders, and the public to make a positive change in communities. What is the speaker series about, and what are we talking about in this podcast?
The purpose of the speaker series is to acknowledge the commitment that every individual has to inclusivity and to address systemic racism. With a focus on anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, and anti-people of color racism, this series seeks to identify the responsibility educators and leaders have to facilitating and supporting anti-racist approaches and strategies within their practice to enhance and transform learning environments and learning cultures. With a specific directive being digital technologies, presenters and guests will discuss racism and tools to support equity, diversity, and inclusivity and the changing dynamics of the digital age.
As a result, at MET, we are committed to a follow-up to each presentation of the speaker series with a call to action challenge. We invite listeners to make one change this month, no matter how small, and share it with us as a next step to this podcast to eradicate racism through community building, education, and through the use of educational technologies. This call to action provides you the opportunities as listeners of this podcast to build on the anti-racist content from the session and make steps towards change. For example, you might indicate what you've heard and thought about from this podcast with a lesson plan that will bring awareness to the issues of racism, Indigenous ways of learning, knowing, and doing, and transformation for students, colleagues, and friends. We will provide you with more details about this call for proposals at the end of this podcast. The topic for today's podcast is transformational practices through an Indigenous lens.
I'm so happy on today's episode to welcome our honored guest, Len Pierre. He's the CEO of Len Pierre Consulting and is a Coast Salish from Katzie First Nation. Len is a professor, consultant, TEDx speaker, social activist, change agent, and traditional knowledge keeper. He has a master's degree in education from Simon Fraser University, focusing on Indigenous curriculum and instructional design. His experience includes Indigenous education and program leadership from various organizations across colonial Canada. He specializes in the development of educational programs and services with decolonization and reconciliation at its core values. He comes to us with an open heart and open mind and hopes to be received in the same way. At this time, we welcome you to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Hi, Chika. Thank you so much. Absolutely. First of all, if I can say, thank you in my language, hi, Chika. Thank you for having me to hold a little bit of space for your viewers and your listeners today. So my name is Len Pierre. My ancestral name is Palikulak, and I am Coast Salish from Katzie First Nation on my father's side and Musqueam First Nation on my mother's side, which is one of the host territories on which UBC is built. I am the owner and CEO of Len Pierre Consulting. We're a tiny but mighty Indigenous consulting firm that specializes in education, training, and project management for any willing service provider throughout Turtle Island, otherwise known as North America. I come to the conversation here today with an open heart and an open mind, and I hope to be received in the same way when we talk about things like transformation, equity, diversity, anti-racism. I think it calls for all of us to have an open heart and an open mind. And I just want to be very transparent from the get-go that I'm here with that openness and that willingness to be here and offer whatever knowledge and wisdom I can to this very important conversation. And I am joining you today from my home territory of Katzie, located in what is known today as the city of Pitt Meadows. Hi, Chika.
Thank you so much, both Tamaka as well as Len. Welcome to the show. It's so nice to have you here. Now, as you've introduced yourself and given us a little bit of information about your background, could you also give us some information about your role as a knowledge keeper in your community outside of that introduction that we received?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think when you think of, and many of you who are listening or watching this, probably have heard of the term knowledge keeper before. Another term I like is knowledge sharer or knowledge holder. But my role as a knowledge keeper is really to act as a historian, to have access to the stories, the myths, the legends, the family histories of my community of Coast Salish families, and more importantly, Katzie First Nation families. But there are many different kinds and shapes and forms of knowledge keeping in Indigenous communities. Some knowledge keepers are really great storytellers. Some knowledge keepers are really great at ceremonies and medicine making. Some knowledge keepers are really great at preserving and revitalizing our ancient traditional languages. And some knowledge keepers are really good at songs and keeping songs or composing Indigenous songs. So my role as a knowledge keeper is to be a a passer on of knowledge. So I often share, the history of Keetsi, how old we are, how long we've been in these lands and territories, and what we've been doing in these lands and territories, stewarding them, protecting them for the future generations, for the unborn children of tomorrow. That's my role as a knowledge keeper.
I love that. And I love the idea of knowledge keeper, but more as that sharer and that holder of that knowledge and being able to bestow that on others. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I would love to, and all of our listeners would love to know more about the work that you do and how
Mm-hmm.
the evolution of that work, where it's come, where it's going, and where your passion comes from for the work that you do.
Yeah, for sure. So for me, I mean, I always identify as an accidental consultant. I mean, this really wasn't in my career trajectory 5 years ago or 10 years ago. This work really started with our company, Len Pierre Consulting, started back during the pandemic when we were all working remotely and virtually over Zoom, never-ending Zoom calls and Teams calls. That's where I had started to, develop a passion for educating large groups of people over Zoom, about Indigenous history, culture, and contemporary issues, back in 2020 ish. And some very interesting things were happening back in 2020. I mean, in the year 2020, the In Plain Sight report was released, in the healthcare setting in British Columbia, highlighting the vast amount of widespread systemic anti-Indigenous racism that exists in the BC healthcare system. The murder of George Floyd happened in the summer, in the United States in 2020. In 2021, we had 215 children that were recovered in a mass unmarked grave at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So it was a very interesting time in 2020 and 2021. So it really sparked this desire to engage workforces and teams and organizations and companies in what are the experiences of Indigenous peoples in this country? What does reconciliation look like? What does that sound like? And then, of course, when September 2021 rolled around, that was the very first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. So the work really started around the need for many organizations, many institutions, Canadian institutions, who were finally ready and willing to lean in, to listen to the conversations and the wisdom and the stories of Indigenous peoples, to listen and learn wholeheartedly to the experiences of Indigenous peoples. So that's really how the origin of our story, where we started. The passion comes from the people we have the opportunity to work with. That's what fills my cup. I mean, I talk about anti-Indigenous racism every single day, and I have been for the last 3 years, 7 years, really, but 2.5 years on my own, working for myself. And people think that that's a really hard job, to really put yourself out there, to be vulnerable, to talk about something people would rather not talk about: racism, inequity, oppression, state violence against Indigenous peoples. But what really fills up my cup is just the passion of the clients that we get to work with, the passion of the audience, the viewers, the people who say, yeah, we're ready. We want to learn more, and we're ready to learn more. Can you help us? And I'm like, heck yes, I'll help you. I'll be there. I'll support you along your learning journey. So my passion comes from the reciprocal nature of the spaces that we hold when we are met with engagement and good questions, and people that are okay to be vulnerable with us and their learning journey. That's where my passion comes from.
Wow. And I think it does take a lot of vulnerability to say, hey, I'm not quite sure how to approach this work or what to do, and really be open. You talked about the open hearts and open minds piece of that. So incredible. And I know we appreciate the work that's being done. It's work that's going to take a long, long time, but it's
Mm-hmm.
purposeful. And it is, as you said, it was needed and it is continuing to be needed. So
Mm-hmm.
thank you for that. And just what are some of the key principles or values that you think underpin Indigenous ways of learning, knowing, and doing? And how do these differ from that mainstream educational approach, would you say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the most fundamental approaches that we use in the spaces that we hold, with me and my team, I have a team of almost 30 Indigenous and non-Indigenous consultants who I get to work alongside. And we all have the same formula in how we hold space, how we share our stories, and how we support the clients that we get to work with. And the guiding star for all of the work that we do is this value of respect for the work, respect for the people who show up to our spaces, and respect for ourselves too, because it's a lot to put ourselves out there and share these stories and share, the atrocities of the past, like the residential schools, the 60 scoop, Indian hospitals, health experimentation on starving Indigenous children in residential schools. We still need to respect ourselves at the same time. And respect is, not just a value we hold in the work that we do. Respect is also one of the oldest laws of these lands and territories. It's embedded into our cultural practices. We have over 640 different First Nations groups in Canada alone. That doesn't even include the Métis or the Inuit. So that's 640 different languages, different customs, different traditional practices, and different traditional laws. But almost every single one of Indigenous communities throughout North America all have this law of respect, this law of respecting one another as fellow human beings, the respect for all living things. So we really hardwire that and mobilize that in our work, respect for the work and respect for the people who we are working with. Other values we have are to be less colonial, to be anti-oppressive. I've learned from Dr. Vicki Reynolds, you can't fight oppression with oppression. So we must strive to be anti-oppressive in the work that we do. We also lean in towards our ancient cultural value and ways of being and doing and knowing of reciprocity. So we're not just going to show up to a space and teach you something. We know that we are learning at the same time too. So we're also looking to learn from our audience. We're looking to learn from the people that we are working with. And the best way they teach us is their hopes, their fears, their concerns for anti-racism work, because there's a lot of hopes and there's a lot of fears around that. And the hopes and fears of transforming education is a lot different than the hopes and fears of doctors who work in healthcare. The hopes and fears of doctors, who want to mobilize anti-racism in healthcare are going to look a lot different than, lawyers working in a government system or a legal system. So we learn a lot. We learn just as much from the people we work with as we hope they're learning from us. So that's the reciprocal nature of that's an ancient Indigenous cultural value. And it's also an Indigenous way of being and doing and knowing. And for, your audience, the listeners and the viewers, for those of you who use the First Peoples principles of learning, know full well reciprocity and respect are hardwired into that work. So that's in stark contrast from a lot of Western colonial, corporate, modern approaches to the work. Corporate approaches are usually quite hierarchical, quite linear, quite didactic. I have the image in my mind of here's somebody pouring out all of this knowledge and then into this empty cup of the learner, of the student. And that's not really reciprocal. That's quite linear. So that's where I see the contrast and maybe how we mobilize our teachings, our cultural values that are as old as time into some of the work that we do that's different from colonial ways.
Amazing. Thank you.
I love that reciprocity piece and the vulnerability piece and sharing on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very important. Do you have any? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's one of the most transformational parts of our work and the practices that we do. In our culture, we have a saying, and that saying is "Don't be backwards." That's a Coast Salish saying, "Don't be backwards." Don't be backwards. It's kind of implying that you make it all about you. So listen to me, listen to me, listen to me. And then when you start sharing your story with me, I'm going to turn my back on you. And it's like, well, it's not really about me anymore, right? And so that's an ancient teaching that we have in our Coast Salish ways of being. And so my dad always taught me that growing up, don't be backwards, son. So I'm like, what the heck do you mean by that? And then when I started teaching this, he's like, oh, I'm like, oh, that's what he means. So another value that we have too is solidarity. Solidarity is so important for us in the work that we do. As Indigenous peoples, we can't do this work alone, right? And we shouldn't do this work alone. We do this work with other, marginalized or targeted communities in this country, people of color. or what I like to call the global majority, we're in solidarity with you. If you are a newcomer to Canada, we bet you experience racism, discrimination just like we do. So we're in solidarity with you too. If you identify as a woman, oh my gosh, I bet you've experienced discrimination based on your gender, right? We got your back. We're going to be here in solidarity with you. If you identify as gay, lesbian, trans, queer, bisexual, two-spirit, non-binary, we're going to be in solidarity with you too. That's what I love about the reciprocal nature of the work. And I think that's also something we can all learn from when we want to mobilize anti-racism work and equity work and diversity work.
Yeah, being in community. It sounds
Yes.
like, yeah, I love that. Thank you for that, Len. Now, do you have any recommendations for listeners regarding considerations when choosing learning technologies in the classroom or in online learning?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I'm always looking for is obviously you want any kind of technologies or resources that you are using. The promising practice, at least in the recommendations or the advice that I would offer, is to always look for Indigenous-led initiatives or Indigenous authored or designed resources. So one of the technologies, or I don't know if this is what you mean by technology, but one of the things that I use with my students is TED Talks. TED Talks, because number one, they are very authentic because they're coming from a living, breathing Indigenous person, and TED Talks are quite accessible, having done two myself. And so I find that it's a good way of amplifying Indigenous stories in the 21st century. And storytelling is an ancient cultural practice that we've been doing in these lands and territories for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. It's a part of our DNA. And so what a beautiful way for non-Indigenous students to learn about Indigenous stories than out of their own mouths on a TEDx platform. Those are things like audiobooks that are produced by Indigenous authors. And more importantly, if you can find some that are authored by elders or residential school survivors, those are really powerful technologies I would use, because it's kind of like this combination of technology with Indigenous culture and tradition with oral storytelling.
It's an incredible way. Yes. And it's an incredible way to really share those stories that without technology didn't transcend cultures and different communities and things like that. So I love that. Now, can you describe some of the traditional teachings and learning methods that have been used within your community for generations? I know one is very much that's kind of an overarching piece is the narrative, that storytelling, but how these particularly influence the ways that communities transmit cultural knowledge and wisdom from generation to generation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the most important ones that is, it's funny, it becomes a trend in education today, but it's just been not a trend in Indigenous culture. It's just been a way of mobilizing knowledge since the beginning of time, is experiential learning. Now, that's what we call it, right? With today's, Western modern education system and pedagogy, we call it experiential learning. But that's all how our learning happened. In a traditional sense. I mean, if you wanted to learn how to hunt, how to fish, how to be a good storyteller, how to be a good leader in the community, or if you wanted to be trained in healing and medicine making, it would come from years and years and years worth of training and mentoring by an elder or a leader who is known to be really good or gifted in that area. And it wouldn't be like, reading in a textbook or studying a lesson. It would be hands-on experiential learning right from the very get-go. And it's so funny because sometimes I run an education company, I will take very intelligent, very highly qualified, educated, learned people who have master's degree and doctorates. And then we go into an experiential learning exercise and I say, okay, can you come and do this? And they're like, can you give me an orientation first? Or is there like a guide? Is there some lesson I can follow? I'm like, no, just put your hands on and start, cedar twining, right? And they're like, no, we need a lecture or something first. So it's very interesting to see these worlds kind of like interweave with one another. But that's how we typically do things in our culture. Everything was experiential. And another modality of passing on knowledge would be the relational. So mentorship and guidance, is something that was 24/7, 365 days a year, not necessarily within a categorical, you're going to be in classroom Thursday evening from 7 till 9:50, every night. And, here are my office hours. And then we end at the end of the semester, right? Which is typically how education and training goes today. But ours was lifelong learning, and so relationships to support your learning, mentorship and coaching and guidance and cheerleading would occur from the moment you met the person until the master, the leader, the mentor would pass on to the spiritual realm. So experiential learning and mentorship were two really, really significant modalities of passing on the knowledge.
That's amazing. And I think slowly, education is getting there, not necessarily in the way that it's that people talk about lifelong learners. They talk about that active participation and that experiential and learn by doing. But do you have any suggestions as to how those practices could be interwoven and integrated into contemporary educational settings?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at diversifying education programs today, we're already doing it. I mean, we have more and more experiential learning programs in various, vocational training programs in colleges and universities. Right. I mean, if you see outdoor schools in elementary schools, first of all, I get really jealous because I'm like, there was no outdoor schools when I was coming up in elementary school. I would love that. Right. Because I think that's ultimately, as when we're children, that's where we're hardwired to be, is outside playing and learning out on the land, not in a classroom with fluorescent lighting and you're in a classroom, a stuffy classroom from 8:30 a.m. until 2:30 p.m. So I already see this diversification of educational programs. What I think that we can all do as educators is to think outside the box, be innovative and creative in how we want to build deeper, more meaningful relationships with our learners. So if we get out of the four walls of the institution and go do a lesson out on the grass, under the trees or under the stars or out on the water, because it has some relevance to the content or the curriculum you're teaching, that's transformational learning. And if you are in a place of investing in relationships, lifelong relationships with learners in a mentorship type of capacity, then I think that's really meaningful as well, because what we're doing is we're community building. And in Western world, in contemporary society, we're really good at community building. I mean, if you have a professional domain, I mean, if you talk to a bunch of doctors, they have their own world. They're out on a different planet, doctors. The same thing for lawyers. Right? We have our own professional practices. And I think that there's a lot of room for mentorship in that. So I already see a lot of these things happening. It's funny because Western science has a funny way of catching up to ancient indigenous knowledge and ways of being and doing and knowing. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, relationships being central to everything. So what would be one really important action that an educator could take to make Indigenous students feel welcome in their classroom every day? Sort of an everyday thing, what's one sort of thing?
Yeah. So I think that and it's such a good question, because my mind immediately goes to, as Indigenous peoples, for far too many years, since the dawn of the education system, entering the hallways and entering the classrooms, as soon as we walk through the door, we either feel one of two eyes. The first eye is we either feel like we're an imposter, or the second eye is we feel invisible. Are we in the right place? Do we matter? Does anybody in this classroom think matter that we have showed up today? And so I think simple eye contact, a smile, hello, and state their name. How are you today? How are things going? Goes such a long way. And I remember, because I have my master's degree in education from Simon Fraser University. And I remember when I first walked into my very first class in my graduate program, I had the biggest debilitating imposter syndrome. Poor classmates of mine were coming up to me and introducing them to myself. And I'm like, I felt like I couldn't hear them. I was so disorientated because I was so anxious. I was like, my imposter syndrome was so bad. And when the lesson started, we're getting settled down to get the lesson started, I kind of felt like I'm going through a million things in my mind. Like, what if I just pretend I was sick and I just left, if I just left the classroom right now? Or I'm pretty sure at some point somebody's going to come out of nowhere and like tap me on the shoulder and be like, "Excuse me, sir, there's been some terrible mistake. You actually didn't meet the criteria to get into this course, so we gotta, escort you out of the thing." Like that's what my mentality was going through. And what alleviated so much was the professor came over to me. He probably saw me sweating in the classroom, really. And he came over and he said, "Hi," because he knew who I was. So he said, "Hi, Len. It's really good to see you. I'm so glad that you're in this course." And he didn't say this he was doing this to a couple of the other students, but then I think he saw what I was going through. And rather than avoiding it or just letting me sit in it, he came and he said, "I remember reading the letter in your application." And we were so excited, and everybody was so excited that we were like, we gotta get Len into this program because he's got some things he's probably gonna teach us. And so him validating me and just seeing me and not letting me be alone in my imposter syndrome and my sense of invisibility, I was like, oh, okay, I can be here and I should be here and I'm in the right place. So when it comes to, and I say that to all teachers, I'm like, don't feel like you're going to step on their toes or make them feel awkward or uncomfortable, but I see you, right? And validation. And as Oprah Winfrey says, right? As human beings, we all want to be validated and we all want to be seen and heard. And that little thing goes such a long way.
Wow.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that story with us, Len. I mean, that's very vulnerable, and it's so important. Everybody does want to be validated, and I mean that is such a beautiful thing that you've taught us today. Just to meet and greet every student and say, "I see you, I see you, and I'm happy that you're here."
Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it also shows courage, showing up.
Mm.
And, that's a huge step in that way, and incredible to be able to kind of say, we value you, but also you had the courage to be here and to show up and to face those fears and those anxieties. And I think that kind of tilts into that next question about in what ways you feel that colonization and historical trauma continue to impact Indigenous education.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
if you want to speak to that, that would be incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, number one, I think that's just important in echoing and reflecting on what you just said. The history of colonization in this country is hardly historical. It's still alive and well today. And state violence and state oppression is still very much alive and well today too. So I think the first thing is for folks who are listening, that it's not a thing of the past. It still very much shows up into our classrooms and into our workplaces every single day. So one of the first things I would say is that it's important to know that our education system is a colonial institution. I mean, especially if you work in colleges and universities, there's only one thing more colonial than colleges and universities, and that's the government. Super, super colonial. So the colonial systems aren't designed with Indigenous peoples in mind. And so that's where the imposter syndrome comes from. So many Indigenous students and learners is I'm not usually reflected in these places of learning. I'm not usually reflected in these places of work. I mean, if you look at all the statutory holidays in Canada, which cultures are complemented with those statutory holidays? Not the diverse multiple cultures that call this place home and have many holidays, right? They're Catholic and Christian religious holidays. And so already there's some misalignment with your own holidays and what you choose to celebrate. So that's almost tenfold for Indigenous learners. There's also high amounts of transiency and high dropout rates among Indigenous learners today. So we are overrepresented in high school dropout rates, but we're also overrepresented in post-secondary dropout rates as well. A lot of us feel so happy getting into our institutions of study, whether it's trades or sciences or general education. We're so happy that we got accepted to university, but staying in university is really, really hard if you're living in poverty or if you're overcoming, mental wellness issues with your own mental wellness. Staying in college and university is really hard, if you have children to feed at the end of every day, multiple children, or if you have aging parents and multiple children. So burnout is another key thing that impacts Indigenous education today as well. And a surprisingly new emerging issue in Indigenous education that is an issue, but it's not necessarily a bad problem, is the burden of representation on Indigenous peoples in education today. Because in full transparency, we as Indigenous peoples have been fighting tooth and nail, blood, sweat, and tears for generations to be included in these conversations, in designing learning programs. And it's been like these little centimeters of movement, of progress that we've made over maybe the last 60 years. But in the last six years, it's like this tsunami has kind of like overtaken all Indigenous professors, all Indigenous support staff, Indigenous administrators, Indigenous learners, elders in residence programs, and First Nations communities. Now there's like a mandate, there's a duty, or there's an encouragement to decolonize their education, to create culturally safer classrooms, to reconcile universities, and all of that needs Indigenous representation. Mm-hmm. So we have these huge colonial systems that need representation from Indigenous peoples. And at the end of the day, there's only so much of us to go around. So I call that the burden of representation. And that's just, it's not a bad thing. We need that. We need that type of engagement on such a massive level. We just have a hard time keeping up to it and keeping up with it. So I think that's important for the audience to take away with, is that can bring us back to this place of patience and humility, that if we are sending out invitations to local First Nations, elders, or maybe even Indigenous staff and faculty in the institution, it's the busiest time I've ever seen for a lot of my colleagues. And I've been in Indigenous education